I want to begin reading in Scripture, and I would like you to just listen for a while, pick up where I'm at, open your Bible and follow along. And when you've got the passage that I'm reading, just put your hand up and let me know that you're with me. And he said, a certain man had 2 sons. It's a giveaway already, isn't it? And a certain man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. So he divided to them his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions in prodigal living. Anybody found the passage yet? We've got one. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, but no one gave him anything. And when he had come to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father, and when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. Where's the passage coming from? It comes from Luke 15. It's possibly the most famous story of all those ever told by Jesus. There was a professor, a theologian in America called Kenneth Bailey. And he had read this story many times, and he thought, I wonder if it's like so many of the other stories of Jesus that are just taken out of the culture and reapplied. The rich man and Lazarus is a very good example of that happening. Jesus takes a common story, reinterprets it, and gives it back to the people. And he thought, this is such a common story in our minds. I wonder whether it's common in the Middle East. And he took a sabbatical, 2 months, and he went to Jerusalem, and he decided to ask around amongst the Arab villages, have you heard this story before? So he would tell the story, and he'd say, have you heard it before? Never. No one had ever heard it before. And he got to the place where he thought, this is weird, and his 2 months turned into 15 years of research. He stayed in Jerusalem for 15 years, and he journeyed from Iran right across to Morocco. He started up in the northern parts of Turkey and went right down into the Sudan. And he told the story, and in 15 years, only 2 cases arose where people have said, that sounds familiar. We had that happen here. In one case, the son asked for his inheritance, and the father was so distressed, he rose up and killed the son. The village had never forgotten it, because Kenneth found out that when a son asked for his inheritance, he was saying to his father, I wish you were dead. I want my money now. I don't want to wait. So that one case, the father rises up and kills the son. And then he met, years later, in yet another village. He told the story, and he said, have you heard the story before? Is it common in your culture? And as he did, a lady rose, and she came to him, and she said, yes, it sounds very familiar. It was my son and my husband involved. And when my son came to his father and asked for his inheritance, my husband gave him his livelihood. He gave him everything. But I want to tell you, it didn't end like this story, because my husband died within a week of a broken heart. That his son was actually saying to him, I wish you were dead. So in all those years, 15 years of research, he didn't come across this story. I'd like you to go to Deuteronomy chapter 21. So if you've got your Bibles, I want you to go to Deuteronomy chapter 21. And I want to read to you where this story has its genesis. Deuteronomy chapter 21, and we'll start in verse 18. It says this: If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son, who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city, to the gate of his city, and they shall say to the elders of his city, This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Sound familiar? He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death. How do they do it? With stones. Shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. Now you know why this story Jesus told was just not in the psyche of the Jewish nation. A stubborn and rebellious son should be dealt with. But the way Jesus tells the story, it's exactly the opposite of that. They have a thing called kazazah. And the Jewish people were challenged to stone or shun anyone who lost their money to foreigners. That's the story of the prodigal son. And what he deserved was stoning in their minds. So when Jesus told the story, this was all wrong. It shouldn't finish this way. This is not the way it should happen. If you go back to Luke 15, and we come down and it says, And he arose and came to his father, and when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and this is significant, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring out the best robe and put it on him. The opposite of what the boy was expecting, the opposite of what the village was wanting to do. Why did the father run? Why was he looking every day to see whether his son came home? Because if he missed a day and his son came back, the stones were waiting at the village gate. And this father loved his son. And so as he waits and he sees in the distance the boy coming, he recognized him before he smelt him. But he smelt him. And he picked up his skirts, and the old man ran. Totally out of keeping with the culture. In the Middle East, old men do not run. Not because they can't, but it's just wrong. They found recently, after a major earthquake in Turkey, they were sifting through the rubble, and they found 5 old men dead under the rubble. And they said, but they were so close. All they had to do was run. And they said, you don't understand. You don't run. Even to save your own life, you don't run. But this father threw away custom and he ran to meet his son. And the first thing he asked for is the covering. But what he did, as he comes and he falls on the neck of the boy and kisses him. Imagine the stench. The boy stinks. He has been feeding swine. He's been living with them. The worst smell to Jewish nostrils came out of a pigsty. And here's where his son has come from. He falls on his neck and he covers his son so that those behind him would have to stone him before they could get to the boy. Powerful story. The father said to his servants, "Bring out the best." One of the things you'll notice clearly is, what did the boy ask for? "Make me like one of your hired servants." Now, there's a very big difference between a hired servant and a household servant. And one of the big differences was that the household servant had sandals. A hired servant did not. So the father says, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and what on his feet? Sandals on his feet. He was never to be seen as just a hired servant. He came home, and to show that he was a son, he got sandals. The other thing he got was a ring on his finger. And that ring was the signet ring that opened the bank's doors. It says earlier in the story that the father gave the son his livelihood. Well, God must have blessed, because when he comes back, it's been replaced. And he gives the boy the signed checkbook and says, "You may have left, but you've come home, and this is your entry to the bank." If we look at it, it puts sandals on his feet. He covers him, the ring on his finger. There's one more thing, and I want to come to that in a few minutes. But before we do, I want to share with you a story. My friend Joe is from Iraq. He was born in the city of Nineveh. Has a fantastic story. I hope someday that he will come to New Zealand, and this month, September. If you've got Joe Kidder coming, do not miss his sermons. You'll be lifted to heaven by him. As he stood in this room, he left Iraq. It was Saddam Hussein that actually signed his visa to leave the country, unheard of. But it happened after 2 weeks of fasting and prayer by his local church. And they took his passport in, and it came back with a visa to leave the country. Just an incredible story. But anyway, finally got to Walla Walla College, where he was studying engineering. God spoke to his heart more deeply, and he ended up swapping out of engineering and becoming a pastor. And he married a girl called Denise, an American girl. Now, he'd left his whole family behind, and when you hear his story, I won't spoil it for you. When you hear his story, you'll understand some of the background of a man who left everything to follow Jesus. He marries Denise, and Denise takes him to a big family reunion. Now, he's out of place because he's the only Iraqi there, little Arab guy, and there's all of these people, and he looks around and he starts to do what we all do, and he says, "Oh, I know who she belongs to. She's with her. And I know that, yes, he's with, yeah." And I'm starting to piece the family together. And as I look at them, I do it myself. I say, "Oh, well, where do you belong?" Well, Joe isn't quite as subtle as that, and he walked over because he saw this fellow that was head and shoulders above everybody else in the room. But there was one thing that was really significant about him. As he looked at this fellow, he thought, there's another odd thing. He's not just tall. Every bit of skin that was showing right up to just below his ears and along his jawline were covered in tattoos. And he thought, he doesn't fit. He doesn't belong here. And he walked over to this man and he said, "Where do you fit?" And he said, "Well, I'm connected here and there." And he put it all together. And Joe said, "Well, tell me a bit about yourself, because you don't fit." And he said, "I'll tell you my story." This young man had studied, I believe, for the ministry, had a fallout with his professors, and eventually left the college and was really angry with Walla Walla College. Strange that it should be the same college. He was so angry, in fact, that before very long he had decided that God was not going to be part of his life. Not in any way. He walked away, he joined the Hells Angels, he became one of the major pushers for drugs in San Francisco. And as he began to tell his story, Joe could see where he had been by his skin. The ink on his skin told the story. And he said, eventually I went down and down and down, and the last straw for me was when the girl I was living with decided she couldn't take it anymore and was going to leave. And he said, after she walked out, I went to the dresser drawer and I pulled out a gun and I put it in my mouth. And I thought, I can't do this anymore. It's over. I want out of it. And he said, I heard a voice, an audible voice, say to me, go to church. And he stopped and looked around and he thought, it must be the drugs. Why go to church? So he didn't do it. And he did that every day. Started the day with the gun and never did it. Finally, on the 7th day, went over, took the gun, put it in his mouth, and as he built up his courage to make his final act one that would send him into oblivion, he heard the voice, go to church now. And he walked out of his room and he began to walk the streets. He didn't know where any churches were, he didn't care. And as he walked through the streets, he finally came to a church, didn't bother looking at what church it was, but the door was open and he went in. And he sat down at the back, and the minute he sat down, everybody around him got up and moved. Well, when you haven't bathed for weeks and you vomited and rolled in your own, you smell. He didn't smell, he stunk. And people just got up. They weren't used to this. I understand. They got up and they left him. And so now he's sitting in the back with a great ring of empty seats around him. And people came in and they were squashing up in all the other seats and giving him a wide berth and hoping, there were prayers, hoping he would go. And the pastor came onto the platform. They went through the process. He finally got up and he took his Bible and looked out at his audience, at his congregation, and he couldn't speak. He closed his Bible and he sat down. Now, if I did that this morning, just started and went back and sat down, after I'd done it the third time, you'd think something was wrong, wouldn't you? You'd be sort of saying, what's wrong with this guy? He's come all the way from Australia and he does that? That's not a sermon. Preach, brother. Well, the congregation's starting to become very uneasy as the third time he sits down and then he comes to the platform, he stands up again, he closes his Bible and he walked all the way to the back of the church. And he reached out his hand and he took the young man's hand, this big, tall guy, and pulled him out of his seat and threw his arms around him and started to weep. And even though he was drugged, even though he was in a stupor, he knew that he didn't like this. And he tried to push him off, and the young pastor said, don't you know who I am? And he said, I don't know, I don't care, get off me. Eventually, he stopped long enough to hear the story. He said, don't you remember me? I'm your roommate from college. I wept when you left. I've prayed for you intermittently over the years. I've wondered where you were. But last Sabbath morning, I was flicking through the yearbook and I looked at your face and God said to me, pray for him now. And I did. And every morning I've got up and the same things happened to me. Pray for him now. And I prayed for you again this morning, not knowing where you were. That young man stunk. The boy stunk. But the pastor's love drew him back into the community. And he said to Joe, you know, I'm the head deacon in my church. And Joe wanted to say, who would have you as head deacon? But he knew the story now. The power of coming home. As we look at the next phase in this story, verse 23 of chapter 15 of Luke. And the father says, "And bring the fatted calf here and kill it and let us eat and be merry." That's a difficult verse for a vegetarian. But there are only 3 occasions in Jewish life when this happened. You had to be fairly wealthy to kill the fatted calf. The average family couldn't do this. You know about the sacrificial system, how if they couldn't bring a lamb, they could bring a dove. And if they couldn't bring a dove, they could bring flour. And you can go through all of that. But this, bring the fatted calf, let us kill it and eat and make merry, only happened on 3 different occasions. The first that I tell you about is at a wedding. And people saved forever. And so when the wedding came, they would have a fatted calf. And the other was after an enormous business deal, when 2 men came together and they said, "Okay, let's seal the deal. We will eat and be merry. We will kill the fatted calf." And the third one, and that's why this is significant, was at the birth of a child, when new life came to a family. What is the father saying? You've been born again. You get a new start. You've come home. You've got the robe. You've got the sandals. You've got the checkbook. But this seals it. This seals the deal. New life has begun. I wish the rest of the story wasn't the way it was. I wish that we didn't even have to read it, but it's the reality for so many of us. And I have to ask the question, if that young man came into my church and sat in the back row of my church, would I hold my nose and hug him? Or would I take a breath and move away? New life starts when a person's welcomed home. We get an insight into the incredible love of the Father, the unbelievable love of the Father. One more story. And I've probably taken Joe's sermon, but go and hear it a second time. He tells it better. He was asked to do a series of sermons down in Miami, and he went to South Bend Airport, and he was late, got on the plane. He stumbled in, found his seat. And in the window seat was a young mother with a babe in arms. And in the next seat was a little 2-year-old with ants in her pants. You know, she was just wriggling and jumping and crawling and talking. And he thought, this is 4 hours with this. Lord Jesus, is there no other place on this plane for me? He asked and found that the plane was fully booked, and he was stuck with the little girl and the mother. And every time the mother paid attention to baby, the little girl played up. Every time she looked at the little girl, the baby played up. So it was just never-ending cycle. And in the end, just to be a nice guy, which he is, he said, "Would it be okay if I read to your little girl?" And he started, and the little girl was mouthing the words and following the story, and everything was going beautifully. I mean, that's the sort of pastor you want, isn't it? So he's ministering to the child, and mum's having a reasonably nice trip. And about 15, 20 minutes out of Miami, the worst storm since the flood hit. And the plane was thrown 1,500 feet straight up, thrown sideways 2,000 feet, then dropped, then moved the other way. And the little girl was great for a couple of seconds. And then she screamed, absolutely screamed. You know, one of those, only little girls do those screams that make your hair stand on end. Little girl screamed. And then Joe began to realise that he was screaming himself. But his screams couldn't be heard because everybody on the plane was screaming. Literally, everybody was screaming. And he thought to himself, this could be my last chance. because it could be their last chance. We could die today. And who on this plane is ready? And so at the top of his lungs, a little Arab man began to preach the gospel. The top of his lungs, he preached about the fact that God loved each one of them. And now it wasn't too late to make a decision for him. And the plane became quiet as Joe preached. And then he began to hear prayers. Our Father. He heard prayers to Allah. People were going back to meet their Maker. About a few minutes out, the storm broke. The plane was still in one piece. They got down on the ground. There was enormous clapping and cheering and whistling, and they were still alive. And as Joe began to realise what had happened, people were coming up and putting their hand on his shoulder and saying, "Thanks for that reminder. We needed that. I needed that so desperately. You don't know how much I needed that." A little Arab pastor preached what he thought might be his last sermon and led dozens of people back to Jesus. Well, it wasn't over, because this woman had a little 2-year-old and a babe in arms and all this luggage to carry. And Joe said to her, "Well, can I help you?" And he put his computer over his shoulder, and he picked up 2 of the cases that the young mother had, and he started to guide this little 2-year-old. And it was fun, you know. She was everywhere, and he was chasing her. He finally got to the place where the glass doors stop people coming in, but you can see through them. And he looked through the doors to see a young man standing there. And he knew immediately who that young man was, because he watched the eyes connect. And he looked as this young father looked into the eyes of his wife and smiled at his beautiful children. And Joe thought, that's beautiful, isn't it? That's really nice. And at that moment, the little baby emptied its stomach of everything it had eaten since birth. And it just came out in a... I don't know how babies do that. I'm pleased I'm past that. I've got grandchildren now, and other people have to worry about that. But it came out all over the mother, splashed into her face, dripped through her hair, and it splashed straight off the mother because Joe had lost concentration. He didn't have the little girl penned in, and it dripped down all over the little girl. And the stench was so horrendous that Joe was now trying to guide the child and breathe. The doors opened. The young father rushed up. He wiped the vomit off his wife's face and held her face in his hands and kissed her and kissed her and kissed her. And then he took the baby and hugged that child, and he knelt down and he wiped the vomit off his little daughter and he hugged her. And I'll tell you something about Joe. When God touches his heart, everybody knows it. And that man knelt down in an international airport and, as only Arabs can, raised his hands to God and said, "Thank you for this beautiful picture of what your love is like. It doesn't matter that she stinks. Your arms of love are wrapped around her." Let me finish with a text. It was read so beautifully. Was it Ethan this morning who read that? It's found in 1 John chapter 3 and verses 1 and 2. "Behold what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called children of God. Therefore, the world does not know us because it did not know him. Beloved, now are we children of God, and it has not yet been revealed what we shall be, but we know that when he is revealed, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." Beloved, now are we the children of God, wrapped in his arms, covered by his robe, given the key to heaven, and above all, accepted because God can't help himself. That's the way he acts. Jesus' story is a unique one. It's a one-off. No other village has told it. It's not in folklore. It comes from the heart of God. Now we are the children of God.